Hello viewers, welcome to Law Excellence. So today we are going to discuss about G7 summit. So today we are going to discuss about G7 summit. So why it was in news? So recently there was a summit, a G7 summit which happened in Japan. So that is the reason why we are discussing about this G7 summit. So now we'll discuss historically when this G7 summit has started and right now what it has actually in this G7 summit, what was the outcome of this G7 summit. So what is it about? All these particular things we'll discuss in this session. So yes, in this particularly why it was in news, yes, the G7 summit was held in Japan. And in this particular summit, the main outcome of this particular summit was de-risking. So de-risking and not decoupling the strategy towards China. So usually, so what is this de-risking and decoupling is about? So before we discuss de-risking de-risking and not decoupling towards China. So why actually this outcome has come up in G7 summit. So before that, we'll start about the origin of G7 summit and what are the countries which are there. And accordingly, we'll discuss about this de-risking concept and also the decoupling concept. So this is our G7 countries. So these are the G7 countries: Canada, France, Germany, Italy and Japan, UK and US. So these are the countries which are there in G7. So this G7 summit or G7 countries are those countries which were actually started after the oil crisis. So we had oil crisis in around 1973. That was the time we had oil crisis. So that was the time this G7 countries have come up. So initially it was G6. And later after Canada got added, it became G7 after Canada. So it became G7 and it was at one point of time it was G8 also. So it was G8 till 2014. So in 2014 when Russia has annexed Crimea from Ukraine, that was the time Russia was actually ousted from this G8 summit and again it became G7 summit. And later this G7 summit also has European Union. So European Union is also part of G7 summit. So G7 summit is an informal summit. It does not have any kind of permanent secretariat. This is an informal summit and also it does not have any kind of permanent secretariat and does not have any kind of headquarters. And these are mostly people like financial ministers or presidents. All of them, they have a kind of informal meeting where they discuss about the international issues or they discuss about especially about economical issues or the issues which are presently of international concern. So which are of international concern and which are mainly of economic issues are what is dealt in this G7 summit discussions. And also this G7 countries are those countries which are mostly advanced countries. And these G7 countries are, we can say these are American and European countries are the one which are mostly in this G7 countries. So it does not have any kind of Asian countries. And as we can see that US and UK, and presently we are in the era where US is the one which is dominating the international sphere. So we can say that US is influencing this G7 country. So and also we are in the present situation where US and China are having a kind of trade wars. So we have a trade wars which are going on between US and China. So that is the reason in this particular summit they have discussed the strategy. What is a strategy towards China? That is, before they started with this decoupling strategy and now they have shifted from decoupling to de-risking. So what is this decoupling and de-risking strategy they have discussed in this particular summit regarding China? This is the important thing which they have discussed in this G7 summit. So because as it is dominated by mostly American and European countries and the countries which have actually of most advanced countries. So here basically as the trade war is going on between US and China. So trade war is those trade war when we talk about, that is when the tariffs are increased. So when the countries follow the protectionist concept, that is here they do not allow the import of other countries properly or they impose high kind of tariffs or high kind of taxes. That is when the other countries will not be able to send their goods. So as we can see, the trade war is going on between US and China, and these two countries are presently involved in this so much of trade war, and because of which they have actually come up with this new strategy. So before and all, the US and other countries were dealing with this decoupling strategy. So when we say the word decoupling, that is something, as right now in economy, in the international economy, every country is involved in the kind of trade between the countries. So when you say the coupling is something when all of them are involved in a kind of good trading. So here they wanted to have this decoupling strategy initially in the starting. So that is, they are trying to avoid the kind of involvement or the economic interactions between the countries. So US was trying to, impose high tariffs, and also it is trying to reduce the goods which are there, which actually are coming from the China. But now this strategy has been changed to de-risking strategy. So what is this whole concept of de-risking strategy? So when we say the word de-risking strategy, it means here they are not talking about any kind of imposition of high tariffs or any such kind of thing. Instead, they are looking at the supply chain. So what happens usually when here they were imposing high tariffs in this decoupling strategy? So because of which maybe the kind of goods which the US or the other countries which were there in the G7, so whatever the kind of goods which they were supposed to get, they are not able to get those goods from China, because already they are dependent on China because of this economically, the kind of involvement they had towards China from so long. So because of which their supply chain is getting affected. And now in this de-risking strategy, they wanted to actually avoid this supply chain clash. So because they are imposing so much of tariffs towards China, and because of which they are having the disruption in their supply chain of the goods which they are supposed to get from China, as they are not getting any kind of enough goods from China, they are having supply chain issues. So which they want to de-risk it. Instead of imposing this decoupling strategy, now they have shifted to the de-risking strategy. So now they'll concentrate on this supply chain disruptions, what is happening, because now that they're not getting proper kind of goods which they were supposed to get from China. So what they will be doing is they will be trying to see the alternatives from there, alternative countries from where they can get the goods, so that it can replace the supply chain clash or disruption which has happened because of the trade war which is going on between the China and US. So that is a kind of main thing which they have spoke about in this G7 summit. And as it is an informal summit, and this summit is something which is mostly of the European and the American countries. And here in this usually G7 meetings are those meetings where they talk about global economic growth, financial stability, and especially about the economic issues. And every year they have a summit, and this annually they'll be having a kind of summit. And this was started after 1970s, that is after the oil shock. And rotating wise, every member country it hosts the summit. So the recent summit was hosted by the Japan, and it is an informal forum. And because of the kind of outcomes which we have in the G7 summit might influence the international arena also. And in this G7 summit usually does not have the Asian countries, but it invites certain Asian countries to participate in this G7 country. So G7 summit. Even India was also part of this G7 summit, and also Ukraine also has come in this G7 informal summit, where they've actually given a kind of support to the Ukraine. And what is the significance of this particular summit? So as we can see that now it has come up with a strategy of de-risking from decoupling strategy. So this is something where it is influencing economically. And also these are the countries which are the most developed countries or well advanced countries, they have a kind of policy coordination. And also global economic stability also can be established, because this summit, the outcomes of this summit can influence the world arena or international arena also completely. Because as we can see, the countries which are there are the most industrialized countries which are part of this G7 summit. And also this G7 summit also has invited, India is also part of the invitees which were there in this G7 summit. That is the reason why it has become important for us to discuss about this G7 summit, and it has become part of this IR. And also here, it does discuss about the international global issues, whatever the present international global issues are going on, like the way we can see that Ukraine war, and also it was discussing about the trade war. So all the kind of global issues and all the global issues were also discussed in this particular G7 summit. And also, when you look at the India and the G7 summit status, so India is a non-member and it is also an invited country. And also we have a kind of partnership, as we also share the values, because most of the countries which are there in this G7 summit are those countries which have the democratic values, or the countries which are the advanced countries. And also India is something which is also becoming a kind of, the developed country in the Asia, and also it is trying to influence internationally. So that is the reason India also has a kind of influence in this G7. And G7 also is in a thing where it wants to influence the global south, that is the Asian and African and the Latin American countries. And also in this G7 summit, they are presently trying to discuss the climate change issues also. And also regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, regional stability. So whatever the international concern is about, as they have the summit annually, every annual summit, every time they have an annual summit. In this annual summit, they do discuss about the kind of international issues which are there. In this particular annual summit, they have discussed the strategy towards the China. So does this G7 summit, does it actually reflect the world today? So yes, so we can say that it does not have so much of inclusivity and representation, because it is mostly confined towards European and the American countries. So it does not have any kind of Asian and African countries. And compared to this G7, we can say that G20 is a broader forum because it has more countries compared to G7. And also it has to address the most global challenges, because here it does not have proper kind of headquarters or institution or secretariat as such. It is just an informal meeting where they are trying to influence the international arena through its informal meetings, and they are trying to have a kind of outcomes. So as such, we can say that yes, it does have certain kind of influence, but compared to this, we can say that G20 is a broader forum. And here, what is the kind of way forward we can say regarding this G7 summit or G7 countries? Or it has to include even the Asian and the African countries, and it needs to cooperate with G20 countries, because whichever the countries which are there in G7 are also part of the G20 countries, and G20 countries also have mostly the Asian and African countries also. And also it has to discuss mostly, so not only just about economical issues, because usually G7 summit, it mostly discusses about the economic issues. Instead of that, it has to go outside the economic issues, and it has to discuss so many multidimensional challenges which are presently there in the international arena. And also it needs to strengthen the global institutions, civil societies, and also the stakeholders also need to be part of the G7 countries, so that they would understand what kind of influence they can do in the internationally, as we can see that the most industrialized or the well-developed countries are part of the G7 countries. And also here, it has to collaborate with the regional organizations. If the G7 countries want to influence internationally in a better way, or it wants to give a kind of policy for the whole world, then it has to collaborate with the other regional organization, instead of confining itself only to the American and the European countries. So that is regarding the G7 summit which has happened in Japan. So the main topic here, they have actually shifted from the decoupling to the de-risking. So that is regarding G7 summit. Thank you all. See you all in the next class.